Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist finishing up 6 weeks of teaching at the University of California, Berkeley at the end of my 2 years' time here, and moving in August 2017, or at the end of August 2017, to the University of Colorado Boulder back home in the Rockies. I'm back today with another video about a topic in Norse language and myth, and today I want to address something that I'm often asked about, either in classes about Norse myth or by email from people who become curious about something because of a video they watched. And that is the large degree of variation that we see in the myths of the Norse gods and heroes that are preserved for us from the Middle Ages. So often today we want there to be a canon, right? We want there to be an answer. Who is Odin? There needs to be an answer that is ironclad and not contradicted in any other source. How does this story go? It needs to have a particular narrative that's not contradicted anywhere. And of course, in the 21st century, it's easy to have, or easier to have, that kind of ironclad narrative. Once a book is published, it has a sort of canon form, right? That's the form that's published in thousands of different copies. Or once a movie has been released, that is the form that it has in thousands or millions of copies. But even in the 21st century, there are still instances of variation. There are director's cuts of movies where the director gets to insert all the pretentious scenes that didn't make it to the cut that was shown in theaters. Or there are second editions of books or later printings of books. My own translation of the Poetic Edda exists in an earlier and a later printing. The later printing updates my job information, which is now itself out of date, and fixes some typos. But there's still sort of the sense that there is one true form of the story, right? Even if we're watching the Gladiator director's cut, we're still watching Gladiator, right? The characters are still the same. The storyline is still basically the same, just with some added flesh on top of the bones. With medieval stuff, it's often much more radical, the kind of variation that we see. It'll sometimes be one or a few elements are the same, while a lot of the bones of the story are actually quite different. There's also quite a bit of fanon in the Middle Ages. I mean, fan fiction. Not that anyone had a live journal account in 1284, but people did write stories that are very much like the fan fiction of today. What if so-and-so got together with so-and-so? What if they had a child? I mean, this is medieval shipping, as they would call it on TV tropes. Or so-and-so is supposed to have the greatest sword ever, but then so-and-so is also supposed to have the greatest sword ever. What if they had a sword fight? Who would win? This is a lot like the kind of things that 13-year-olds sit around and talk about at the campfire. Or what if so-and-so teamed up with so-and-so and they fought an even bigger enemy than they had ever fought before? Or what if so-and-so married the daughter of so-and-so? These scenarios are all found in medieval sagas. And of course, we have a tendency as students of that literature to, revere is a strong word, but to prize what has come down to us, what has survived from that time, and legitimately, because there's such a limited amount. But the fact is, a lot of it contradicts other sources, and a lot of it may be more canon than others. But even with the canon, there's an issue. I mean, think about Christianity today. Most denominations agree about what books make up the Bible, the Old and New Testament. There is some variation. There's the Apocrypha, which will be accepted by some different churches and not by other churches. But for the most part, the text is agreed upon. There's a canon of the Old and New Testaments. But even with that canon established, there is still a lot of variation in what actual practicing Christians believe. Right? There's a big difference between a Southern Baptist in East Texas and an old believer in Russia and someone in the Armenian church or the Ethiopian church or a Roman Catholic in Poland. I mean, all of these have different practices, different actual day-to-day prayers, and the actual beliefs of the individual in his or her heart of hearts are probably fairly different. And then over time, Christianity has also changed quite a bit. Most Christians today in the United States, I would wager, uh, think about heaven and hell as a permanent destination that you go to right after you die, and this never changes. Once you're in heaven forever. Once you're in hell forever. But earlier Christians often believed in a resurrection of the flesh that would precede that heavenly kingdom, right? We would come back in our bodies and inhabit the heavenly kingdom on earth, rather than there being sort of a heaven that's just a destination of your spirit, there was a heaven that was a destination of spirit and flesh alike. And there are Christians today who believe this, but I think that it's more of a minority understanding today. So we have to remember that every religion, every belief system has variation, and this is nowhere more true than in myths. And of course, by myth, I mean a narrative, right? So even if you believe that a story is true, its status as a narrative of supernatural events makes it a myth, right? So even someone who believes in the literal truth, say, of the life of Jesus, can speak of the mythology of Jesus, right? These narratives that are built around him. So in Norse myth specifically, we see much of the same kind of variation that I was talking about with Christian myths today. There's variation over time. For instance, in the actual medieval sources that survive for us to read today, sources like the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, and some of the sagas, Odin is the chief god. Odin is the head of the pantheon. He's not necessarily the most worshipped, the most popular god that appears to have been Thor, but he is the one who's kind of in charge. But it's interesting to note that the name of the god Tyr, who is not a big element in any of the myths that have survived for us today, there's a few myths about him, about his hand getting bitten off, about Thor and Tyr going to get a beer cauldron from Tyr's dad, who's a Jotun or giant. But he's not in a lot of stories. He's not apparently a central member of the pantheon. But his name is cognate with, comes from the same root word in Proto-Indo-European as the name Zeus in Greek, or Jupiter, Zeus father, in Latin, or Jausptar in Sanskrit, all of whom are central sky gods. So it's quite possible that at some point in the past, Tyr was the head god. Now, sometimes people will take any hint like this, right, in the medieval sources, and they'll spend thousands of web pages out of it. So of course you'll find people who claim Tyr is the main god because, and basically this traces back just to the fact that his name is cognate with the head of the pantheon in related Indo-European traditions. But we have to remember there's actually nothing in our medieval sources that points to Tyr being in that role. So even if he once was, in the time period that we're reading about, he wasn't. Similarly, we have a lot of evidence for worship of a god named Ullr. Now, his name is probably related to a root for glory. So this is, an impressively named figure. There are many, many places in Scandinavia named after him. And there are some personal names, especially at a very old level in runic inscriptions, for instance, that appear to include his name. But in the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, he is scarcely mentioned at all. Snorri says that he has something to do with skis. In the Poetic Edda, there is an oath that's sworn, if I remember right. I think that's in Gudrunarkvitha 3, that an oath is sworn on a ring of Ull. But, basically he's gone from the myths that we actually have. Now, this is interesting. He was clearly an important figure at one time. Saxo also mentions him as an Olorus. So who is he? Did he just disappear from the awareness of pagans in the late Viking Age, so that he just didn't make it into the sources that were written down for us in the 1200s? Or was he renamed? Is Ullr the same figure as, say, Heimdallr? If he was the same as any figure, I would think it might be Heimdallr, because there are no places named after Heimdallr, for instance. So if maybe Heimdallr's name had changed over time, it might make sense that, we have places that are named for him in his earlier name. I don't know. But Ullr was clearly important under that name in, say, the pre-Viking Age Scandinavia and maybe early Viking Age Scandinavia, and seems to have just disappeared by the late Viking Age, when our earliest poetic sources come from. Then there's the question of Frigg and Freya. I've discussed this in a separate video that I'll link at the top right in the card. But in short, it looks like Frigg and Freya, the two main goddesses mentioned in Norse myth, might once have been considered the same person, at least in some parts of Scandinavia. We don't have them treated as one person in our sources that survive to us, right? In the Poetic Edda and poems like Lokasenna, Oddrunnar Grótr, these are two different goddesses. But there are a lot of traces, like the names of their husbands, which both seem to be just variations of the name of Odin, and right down to their own names, that suggest that they might once have been just one person that's later been split into two goddesses. So, you could look at this and you could say, well, what's right and what's wrong? Is Frigg the same person as Freya? Is that correct? Is Frigg not the same person as Freya? Is that correct? I mean, really, there's not a correct and incorrect here. There's probably just different layers of time. I mean, another analogy you could make is social standards in the United States. Think about what was socially acceptable sexual mores 100 years ago. And think about what's socially accepted sexual mores today. Right, well, which one is right and which one is wrong? It depends on whether you're asking somebody from 1917 or somebody from 2017. And of course, there'll be variation in both times. There would be people from 1917 who were very libertine. There would be people from 2017 who were very conservative. And it's just a matter of perspective and how much time passes. So there were probably people, if Frigg and Freya were once one figure, there were probably people at a very late time who considered them one figure, and there were probably people at a very early time who had begun to split them. Variation doesn't just occur over time, but also occurs between sources that are preserved for us. One of the most interesting cases, I think, is the figure of Helgi. Now, in the Poetic Edda, there are 3 poems about him. These are called, in the order they appear in the manuscript, Helgakvida Hundingsbana 1, so the poem of Helgi, killer of Hunding, number 1. Helgakvida Hjorvarsonar, the poem of Helgi, son of Hjorvarder, and then Helgakvida Hundingsbana 2. Now, these 3 poems all tell basically the same story. In each one, there is a hero named Helgi. In 2 of them, at least, he does not have a name until he is a teenager. In all 3 of them, he falls in love with a Valkyrie. In Helgakvida Hjorvarsonar, her name is Svava, and in the other 2, her name is Sigrun. And in all 3 of them, there is an insult fight between Helgi's sidekick and some enemy's sidekick. So in Helgakvida Hjorvarsonar, Helgi's associate Atli, who is sort of his dad's right-hand man, has an insult battle with this giant woman named Hrimgerðr, daughter of Hati. And then in the Hundingsbana poems, it's Sinfjotli, his half-brother, who has an insult battle with a guy named Hroðbrodr on the shore, who's the brother of a guy that Helgi is leading a military campaign against. So these elements are the same, but Helgi is not presented as being the same guy. In the poem Helgakvida Hjorvarsonar, which in my translation, I moved that ahead of the 2 about Helgakvida Hundingsbana just for the sake of the reader's sanity. In this poem, he is the son of a fellow named Hjorvarder, as implied by the poem's name, and he is said at the end to be resurrected or reincarnated. So this reincarnation is probably actually an explanation for why there's also a Helgi in the next 2 poems, who is the son of Sigmundur, who's one of the Volsung heroes. In actuality, the original story probably isn't that he's reincarnated, it's that there are versions of the story where Helgi is the son of Hjorvarder, and there's versions of the story where he's become drawn into the stories about the great Volsung heroes. This is probably later that he's drawn into the Volsung family and made into a son of Sigmundur. But then a lot of the basic elements of the story are kept, and even in the case of the poems where he becomes the son of Sigmundur, he becomes a Volsung, there's variation. So Helgakvida Hundingsbana 1 and Helgakvida Hundingsbana 2 don't tell the same story. They tell what's recognizably probably built to the same core story. Right? The skeleton of all 3 of these poems is the same, but the flesh and blood on top is quite different. I would compare this to the way that very popular narratives today can draw in elements from narratives that aren't connected to them. So, for instance, there's a huge fan base for things today like Harry Potter and Star Wars. And it would not be surprising if, say, nuclear fallout killed off all but a few thousand people, that a few hundred years from now, the descendants of those survivors would be telling stories about Harry Potter, or stories descended from the books and movies about Harry Potter. And it would not be surprising if these stories about Harry Potter had begun to incorporate elements of stories that were not originally about Harry Potter. So you might, for instance, have a story about Harry Potter visiting Yoda, right? Yoda from the Star Wars franchise gets drawn into the Harry Potter family of stories. Or, Harry Potter becomes Harry Skywalker or something like that. Some element that's popular from this other fan base gets drawn into the more popular fan base. Something like that is probably happening with the Volsungs, and it also happens with the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, where this fellow, who is probably based at least somewhat on a historical figure, he becomes drawn into the Volsung family in his own highly fictionalized saga. There's also variation, of course, between sources written by completely different authors. With poems like the Helgi poems, we don't know who composed them. We don't know exactly where, exactly when. But with Snorri Sturluson and Saxo Grammaticus, both writing in the early 1200s in Iceland and Denmark, respectively, and often telling similar stories, it's still striking how much variation there is between them. I've talked in another video, I'll link this one in the card too, about the Norse myth of the death of Balder. Snorri tells the more famous story, and of course Snorri being probably on the whole a much more reliable source than Saxo, it's Snorri's story that's become famous today about how Loki tricks the blind god Hodr into killing his brother Balder with a mistletoe. Saxo's story is extremely different, where Hodr, he gives Latin names to everybody, so Hodorus kills Balderus, but they're not brothers. Hodorus is not blind. They have a battle over Nanna, a woman who in Snorri's version is just the wife of Balder, with no comment about there ever having been a battle for her. Both stories do contain strikingly similar elements, though. For instance, the element about Balder being impervious to all weapons except for one thing. What that one thing is different, but still, it's a striking similarity. Just the way that Odin tries to get revenge, Odinus in Saxo, of course, right, tries to get revenge for the death of his son Balderus, is the same. He has a child with a woman named Rind, or Rinda in Saxo's Latin version. So there's clearly some kind of core tradition that's informing both Snorri and Saxo. And which one is right? Is Saxo taking pieces of a story he doesn't know and making up the connections? That's possible. Is Saxo inheriting some much older story, a variation of the Balder story that was current in Denmark, where he was writing, that's equally as old as the Icelandic version that Snorri is telling? It's hard to say, but both survive to us from about the same time of writing. Even in Snorri himself, there's variation. So, Snorri versus Snorri. Snorri is credited with the Prose Edda. He's also credited with Heimskringla, a history of the kings of Norway that includes, as its first saga, Ynglinga Saga, the saga of the royal families, the legendary royal families of Sweden and Norway. In Ynglinga Saga, he tells some of the myths about the gods, because he's explaining the gods as human ancestors of these kings who were later misinterpreted as gods. This is part of Snorri's whole shtick in the Prose Edda too. But some of the stories he tells are quite different in Ynglinga Saga from the versions of the stories he tells in the Prose Edda. For example, when he talks about the war between the two families of gods, the Aesir and Vanir, the story about that is concluded with the gods spitting into a cauldron and making this figure called Kvasir, whose blood is later used to make Othravir, the mead of poetry. But in the version in Ynglinga Saga, there's no trace of that particular story, the war between the Aesir and the Vanir ends quite differently with an exchange of hostages, some of whom aren't even mentioned in the Prose Edda version. And then in the saga of the Volsungs, which I'm happy to say, this is August 1st, 2017 as I'm speaking. As of yesterday, this book is published, so hopefully that will start shipping soon. My translation of the Saga of the Volsungs. Very, very pleased with that. Anyway, in the Saga of the Volsungs, there is a tree called Barnstokkr that's a very important centerpiece in the hall of Volsung, the hero that the rest of the family is named for. And from one chapter to the next, it's called a different type of tree. Right, so there's probably a version of this story where it's an apple tree and a version of the story where it's an oak tree, or maybe these are coming from different poems that the saga author was working with, one of which it was called an apple, one of which it was called an oak, based on alliteration or something. But, you know, it's just not as consistent as 21st century authors would probably be. And then, speaking of my new translation of the Saga of the Volsungs, it includes with it the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. This is actually written as a sequel to the Saga of the Volsungs, so the first chapter of the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok just picks up as if you've been reading the Saga of the Volsungs. So I thought it would be fun to include, especially since Ragnar has become so famous today as the hero of the Vikings TV show. Well, the very fact that he's connected to the Volsung family is probably the result of what today we would basically call fan fiction. Ragnar's story is, as I mentioned before, and I've mentioned in my video about him that I'll link in the top right here, probably distantly based on a Viking hero in the early 800s with a similar name. The Volsung stories are based very distantly on events from the end of the Roman Empire hundreds of years before that. And yet, in Ragnar's saga, he is connected to the Volsungs as the son-in-law of Sigurdur the Dragon Slayer, the greatest hero of the Volsungs. He marries Åslaug, a sort of fan fiction daughter that the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok just seems to conjure out of thin air of Sigurdur and Brynhildr the Valkyrie that he never actually married. This daughter, Åslaug, is mentioned one time in the Saga of the Volsungs, and considering that the one medieval manuscript where the Saga of the Volsungs is recorded, it is paired with the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, you can't even be sure that Åslaug was originally even in that one place. She could have been dropped there just to prime the reader for the continuation, which is the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. So he is drawn in, like Helgi, into the Volsung story, but this is even more striking because, of course, you have to play with the timeline so much, and you have to insert a whole new daughter of one of the most famous figures of the entire mythology just to work him into it. And then there is another saga called Thidrek Saga of Bern, the saga of Thidrekr Bern. This is translated by Edward Hames, if you'd like to look for that translation. I believe that was published in 1988. I call Thidrek Saga the Norse Justice League. In this saga, all kinds of different Norse saga heroes and then also like biblical and Homeric heroes get drawn into this too, or at least their names do, and it's so weird. This guy Thidrekr, he throws together a team of heroes. It includes Sigurdur from the Volsungs with a very different origin story about him. They have it's like a Justice League or an Avengers situation where he has to test the different heroes to make sure they can join the team. Sometimes this is combat. In one memorable case, he has to be out-partied by a son of Volander who wants to join the team. It's a weird story. But anyway, it's sort of like, I imagine that the impulse in creating a saga like this was not too different from the impulse that makes people create something like the Justice League of the Avengers. What happens if we pair all these heroes together? If Sigurdur is awesome on his own, what about if we team Sigurdur up with Thidrekr and, Samson and the son of Volander and all these other heroes? And then sometimes the variation that we see is not so much due to variation in the medieval sources as it is so little detail in the medieval sources that people try to make too much of it today. One of the most interesting cases of that is the name of Loki being compared to the Old Norse word Loki. Now, Loki means flame. Now, in a story in the Prose Edda, Loki has to have an eating contest where he fights against, he eats against Logi, who literally is flame. And this is probably the first place that this comparison between the names was made. But it's extremely unlikely that the origin of Loki is actually related to the word flame. Nonetheless, the fact that his name probably is related actually to the word lock, right? He's the closed up one, the locked one. But just the fact that he's compared there to flame, and the fact that the names do look similar, has led to a widespread misunderstanding of Loki as sort of a fire god. But in fact, in the sources that we have, there's no special association of him with fire. Loki mostly is a guy who has sort of halfway clever plans that occasionally hurt the gods and occasionally help them. And his role as a trickster, I think, even gets overplayed today. And part of that is just how much people have fallen in love with the Avengers character. But his tricks in the Norse stories really aren't usually extremely clever. They usually just involve some kind of lie or deception that involves him changing shape. So we've also made him into more of a trickster figure today that fits our own proclivities. That something that excites people today more than maybe the story of Loki turning Idun into a nut would. And then there's names like Sjöfn. Snorri in the Prose Edda lists a lot of different goddess names that are probably actually not separate goddesses. At any time that anyone believed in these goddesses, in the Norse gods and goddesses, they're probably alternate names for Freya and Frigg. I've talked about this in another video that's pretty closely related to this one. One of the most famous of those is Sjöfn, which Snorri says is a goddess of love. Since nothing excites people more than love and sex, everybody wants to know what goddess of love to pray to make some girl impressed with them. People get interested in Sjöfn, they want to know about Sjöfn, but in fact Sjöfn's mentioned in one place, and that's Snorri's Prose Edda. The goddess who actually seems to be most associated with matters of love is Freya. Well, I hope this has been somewhat interesting and informative for you, and I have dealt with the sun coming through the window by putting my hand there. Anyway, I hope that you'll also check out some other videos on this channel, and from the University of California, Berkeley, where the sun shines too bright and it's always way too hot, I'm wishing you all the best.